So there's this podcast that I really love called Ear Hustle about life in prison. And I recently listened to this sort of loose 3-part series they produced on California dismantling its death row and sending condemned inmates into the prison's general population. Now, I was spouting off at Nick about it because I thought it was a really, really interesting.
Yes.
And he told me something he tells me a lot, which is save it for the pod.
I just said, don't tell me now. Just write down those thoughts and we'll make a podcast out of it because I don't really want to hear it. That's not true. Actually, what's awesome about this episode is it gets back to the roots of Muriel's murders. We started this Muriel's Murders True Crime podcast because you kept telling me about your podcast, and I was like, it's actually interesting when you talk about it.
Yeah, right.
And that's what this is.
Yeah,
you
totally.
know, you were telling me about a podcast, and I said, shut up, let me hit record.
And, you know, it's like also really classic because I went down the rabbit hole for a long time. It's supposed to be one episode.
Yep.
And it's 2 hours long. So
It's
we
a
split
two-parter.
We split it into 2 parts because I'm not going to do more than an hour an episode anymore. Anyway, here we are.
Everyone loves you.
So for this episode, we used Ear Hustle's episodes Slam That Door, which is season 15, episode 3, and then Different Sides of the Earth, season 15, episode 4, and finally, Why Doesn't Ear Hustle Talk About People's Crimes, season 15, episode 5.
Whoop, we got some sirens in the background too. They were just like, you guys need some sound effects? Why do we talk about crime? That does not sound like why do I do that? That was the weirdest
so
sound effect I
awkward.
ever made.
All right,
Really
so
apologize,
apparently this is
everyone.
the true story involving murder, violence, drugs, adult themes, etc. But you signed up for this, so it's your funeral, man.
Yeah, and apparently we're comedians. Apparently we make jokes and try to be funny. So I guess brace for that and bad words.
Ooh, watch this, I'm on video. Ooh. All right, Nikki, are you ready to hear this story?
No.
Okay, let's get started. All right.
Yeah.
Ear Hustle. I've been listening to this podcast for years. I highly, highly recommend it. It's hosted by 2 people, Nigel Poor and Earlonne Woods, and then they have a team of producers inside and outside of San Quentin. So Nigel taught photography to inmates at San Quentin for years, and then Earlonne was also an inmate there. After being convicted of attempted second-degree robbery when he was 25, Earlonne was sentenced to 31 years to life in prison under California's 3 strikes law.
It was his 3rd felony.
It was, and he has kind of an interesting story. So he committed his first 2 felonies in one offense as a juvenile.
Oh, whoa.
So he was a part of kidnapping and robbing a drug dealer in LA. He was a part of a gang. And he didn't realize that the juvenile offenses also counted towards this 3 strikes law. So when he got 31 to life, it was just totally blindsided. And he was, just 25. So anyway, including 2 prior stints in prison that he had as a juvenile, Earlonne served a total of 20 years in prison. I'm sorry, 27 years in prison before his release. So in 2017, while serving time at San Quentin, Earlonne started this podcast with Nigel, and then his sentence was commuted by Governor Jerry Brown in 2018. So, ear hustle, that phrase, it's a prison slang for eavesdropping, and they created this show to highlight slice of life experiences of living in prison. So after Earlonne was released, they expanded the podcast to include prison experience nationally and internationally, and, to cover people who were out for the first time and what that's like, and people on parole, and all people who have family in prison.
I've listened to a few episodes, and each one is like totally its own adventure.
Yeah,
it's
totally.
like, here's something completely different yet about prison.
Yeah,
and prisoners,
their lives, right?
Yeah.
So the point of the podcast is to tell everyday stories from inside a prison. How do you cook in your cell? What's your favorite thing to eat? Who was your worst cellmate, or like what's it like to fall in love or maintain your relationships with kids in prison. So often the crime the person did to get into prison isn't actually relevant to the story they're telling, right? Their thing is to kind of come from a non-judgmental space and just ask people about what their lives are like day to day. What did you do today? What is the specific thing, right? Now, early on, Erlon and Nigel realized that the people they were talking to may have done something so terrible that listeners, may not even want to listen to this story if they knew the crime beforehand.
Right.
So knowing the crime and judging the crime, they found distracted listeners and kept them from actually listening to like an interesting story that had value in its own right.
Right, like hearing the story about trading like cigarettes for ramen and how you heat it up is like maybe less cute if they're also in there for like double murder.
Right.
Right.
Exactly. And I think that that's a criticism of the podcast, which I totally get. I think that what they're attempting to do when they say they're being non-judgmental is just allow people to talk. So if it's cute, that's not their choice.
Yeah.
Right? It's just the story that somebody tells, and then we have this emotional reaction. So some people, I think that there is a criticism of like, oh, they're cute stories.
Yeah.
But really, they're just stories of people, and they're telling them themselves. So it's kind of a, I think that there is a difference in that. But that is true, what you're saying. It's like it's less cute.
Right. Well, and if I'm not mistaken, it's like the point of the show is to like humanize these human beings that are like locked away and we literally don't see, and be like, actually behind those walls are humans, right? So if that's the goal of the show, which I think it is, I could be wrong, but that seems like the goal of the show to me, then knowing what they did is sort of irrelevant a little bit.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's what they're saying, right? Mm-hmm. And also they found like talking about the crimes were really complicated. Like, how much of the crime do you actually talk about? Do you tell the whole crime from beginning to end? That would take up the entire episode, and then they would just have a true crime podcast, right? It wouldn't be the podcast that they're trying to make.
Right.
And also, like, do you tell everyone's perspective, the victims and the perpetrators? Do they tell the backstory of the person's lives? And another aspect of this was Nigel was trained to not ask about crimes because she started as a teacher at the prison, and that was part of the rules, right? She used to never look up people's crimes as a rule of working there. And sort of philosophically, she thinks like wanting to know is just human curiosity. That's fine, but it's not actually important to her, right? And Nigel noticed when they do look into the crimes of people that they're interviewing, the tone of the room shifts. The production team, like the producing team, tends to get a little gossipy, right? Like it always kind of, for her, she said the tone almost always shifts into like them not being their best selves.
Is the production team also all prisoners?
There are two. So there's like an inmate production team, and then there's also an outside production team. So there's
but
a
when
lot
she's
of people,
talking about people that get gossipy and not their best selves, she's talking about the other inmates.
all of them. And them, like the outside production team for sure. Yeah. Boop, boop, ba-doo, lost my place. That's fine. Whatever. That would be something I'd normally cut out, but now we're doing full takes. All right. So over time, that started changing. Now the producers, they want to know people's crimes because they want to know what's publicly available. Because, they may not include it for their reasons, but people just make Google stuff and read it regardless of whether or not they include it. So it's not necessarily like keeping them from having that perspective, if that makes sense.
Yeah, right. Yeah. If you're listening to the story about so-and-so, like fill in the name, and they're in this prison, you could just Google that person's name and the prison. And
then you think about the episode in a different way. And they're like, if it's very obvious who these people are, they kind of want to be aware of it. And also, sometimes the crime does inform the story. For instance, they did this episode, I think, called The Big No-No. And it was about inmates starting relationships with volunteers. So that's like a big no-no, but it totally happens.
Okay.
And there was this super charming, I listened to this episode and it was pretty fascinating. So there was this super charming inmate telling the story about falling in love and starting a relationship with a female volunteer. And he sounds kind of feminist and like kind of like, you know, in touch with his feelings, all this stuff.
Yeah.
And Erlon, I think, not on mic, but like later was like, you know, I think he might have known the guy. Anyway, after they were done interviewing him and putting the story together, Erlon asked Nigel, do you know what this guy's in for? Because he murdered his ex-partner, the mother of his child.
Yeah, right.
You know, and it changes the whole perspective of what he's doing. Like he was going to get maybe paroled and maybe move in with this person. You know, and then they had to go back and re-interview him with that knowledge and kind of, you know, hold him to it, talk to him about his crime. And then they've done other pretty powerful episodes that included inmates' crimes. Like Erlon did an entire podcast on his life and the crime that landed him his longest prison sentence. And there was another one I've talked to you about before. It was called Dirty Water. And that dealt with self-described pimps and victims of sex trafficking. And I think the main point of the episode was really like exploring restorative justice.
Yeah, I remember this. Yeah.
But the crimes definitely informed the interviews in that episode. It was really powerful. But for the majority of the episodes, Ear Hustle still doesn't include the crimes their interview subjects committed. And that was their approach when it came to these death row episodes.
Is it a huge backtrack if we talk just a little bit about the restorative justice episode?
No.
Well, what I remember being really interesting about that is it was like, if I'm not mistaken, it's like restorative justice is sort of where like perpetrators of crimes meet with like victims of similar crimes, like maybe not their specific victims.
Yes.
Right. But it's just like, you know, if you murdered a child, you might meet like the mother of a child who got murdered or something. Right. And so they were setting these pimps up with like prostitutes basically and these guys were in jail, I think if I remember correctly, because they were pimping out like children, like underage girls, and these girls had been underage prostitutes themselves, and there was like this weird missed line of like they were like not connecting because the ex-pimp was like, well, you know, you were never raped, and the girl's like, yeah, but I was a kid, so I was right. Like I was a child, like no matter what, that is, and he just like couldn't get that, like that wasn't computing, and that was like a part of why this restorative justice episode was really interesting and complicated.
Yeah, that's exactly. I mean, there is this kind of cognitive, you know, there was this cognitive dissonance between like just understanding what sex trafficking actually is. They're victims, they're children, they're victims, you know, and we're talking like teenagers, right? Like, you know, under 18. Yeah, that was a really interesting one. And, you know, you'll have like these moments listening to it that I find are really interesting too, where like, I think Erlon and Nigel are excellent interviewers and they really do. Like the people they talk to a lot of times have like probably, you know, thought about or talked about the same things over and over again. So like if they're talking about their story or, you know, talking about forgiveness or talking about whatever, it's like it's rehearsed. And at first listen, it sounds like, okay, yeah, like I get his point. And they're able to kind of find like little moments of friction when you're thinking like, you know, that does sound a little bullshit. Like, let me like lean into that and be like, actually re-explain this. They're pretty aggressive with their questioning.
Yeah, they've probably just been listening to people like spin their justifications for years or whatever. And like, I can tell when this like dips into like personal bullshit.
Right. And it's less than you'd think often in this podcast. And partly is because I think the people who want to participate in the podcast are all like very much kind of wanting to work towards their rehabilitation. So like a lot of people are like, I'm not going to be on your podcast. And then you'll get people who are like, oh, that guy is scary as hell. And then you'll get a lot of guys who are like genuinely like working to get out of prison and like, you know, going to therapy, going to AA, like trying to put their life back together.
Totally. Anyways, back to our ladies on death row.
Yes. So California has the largest death row in the country, which I didn't know. Over 600 men and 20 women are in the California prison system with death sentences. And there have been several moratoriums on execution in California over the years. The last person to be executed by the state of California was killed in 2006. And then Governor Gavin Newsom imposed another moratorium on executions in 2019 that still stands today. Right now, California is in the process of dismantling the physical sites of its death row and sending the condemned inmates into the less restrictive housing in the general population, or what we call like the mainline prison population.
What we call the main line as ear hustler listeners.
We know.
You know us, just in the hustle crew.
So Ear Hustle produced an episode from San Quentin interviewing male death row inmates making the transition from death row facilities to the mainline housing. And then they released an episode detailing the same transition for the female death row inmates being held at California Correctional Women's Facility, or CCWF. They didn't include any of those people's crimes. The episodes were really fascinating and struck a strong contrast between the men and the women's experiences. But of course, after listening to everything, my nosy ass wanted to know what everyone was in for. I was up in the middle of the night just like Googling.
Yeah.
I have a terrible personality. So instead of working on an episode, I spent a couple hours Googling everyone, trying to figure out who they were and what they did. And I'm going to be straight up and say, I think Ear Hustle has legit ethical and creative argument for why they didn't include the crimes in these episodes. I don't have an argument for including them. I'm just curious. We're all in this together, my fellow rubberneckers.
Well, doesn't Ear Hustle not like true crime?
Yes and no. You know, I would say they for sure are doing something that is like journalistic and like kind of radical and interesting.
Yeah.
And they definitely called true crime the true crime industrial complex. But I would say they recently got a new producer, it's producer Amy, and they're a little more flexible. I think like for sure Nigel's not into it. Amy, I think, is a little more like, there are a few that I kind of wish we could just go the true crime route for.
Yeah.
And also they acknowledge, like, if we did a true crime episode, they'd probably be way more popular and make way more money. Like, it's just a popular thing. But I think that, like, it's a more, you know.
Well, when the hell is that going to start working for us?
We'll see, Wilbur. Who knows, man? But, you know, like, I think they're a little mixed now. But,
Okay.
you know, whatever.
Yeah. All right.
Anyway, here's a recap of the 2 death row episodes, including all the crimes.
Okay.
All right, so we're going to start with season 15, episode 3, Slam That Door. It follows 4 guys making the transition from death row to the mainline population. There's Steve, who spent 35 years on death row. Cujo, who spent 26 years on death row. Vo, who spent 29 years on death row. And Shaka, who spent 42 years on the row.
Damn.
In San Quentin, death row had a whole separate facility from the main line, like a dark, dingy, mostly windowless, lockdown facility. And inmates would spend 23 hours a day in their cells, right? They get an hour to go out in the yard, but that's it. And they spend most of their time shackled and handcuffed to their waist chains. Some people, for decades, ate every meal alone in their cell, almost completely isolated. And when they had to be transferred to different areas of the prison, the other mainline inmates were forced to face the walls and avoid looking at them. So they spend all their time isolated in a cell. And when they walk through with other people, they're all required to turn their back.
As a punishment to the death row dude.
No. This is actually for the condemned inmates' safety, because a lot of the death row guys were really famous and kind of in danger of being attacked or killed by other inmates. And they're also totally shackled and locked down so they can't defend themselves.
Yeah.
You know, it was either for maybe notoriety, to look like a big guy who killed Charles Manson or something, or retribution. You know, certain crimes, like crimes against children, are very unpopular in prison.
Right.
And, you know, officers wanted to prevent prison justice from playing out.
Right.
But now, for the first time, these guys who've spent over half their lives in the isolation of death row, they're being sent out to live in the main line. This was a huge, scary transition for most of them. They hadn't been able to walk through a door on their own, or walk without shackles, or walked unescorted in like 20 to 40 years, right?
Jesus.
They had no idea how to navigate the chow hall. Like, they had been fed through a slot in a door for decades, every meal. You know, they didn't know if they were allowed to get silverware, or like even how to navigate finding a seat at a table.
Yeah.
Steve, who'd spent 35 years on death row, said the first time he saw guys sort of speed walking to the chow hall for dinner, he backed up against the wall and froze, because he couldn't figure out why these guys were walking so fast. He thought they were either running from some bad trouble or toward it, right?
Yeah.
And Steve didn't move until one of the guards called out to him and told him to calm down. People were just going to dinner, you know.
And they're not offering like a little coaching session on how things work. They just put them in there.
You know, they didn't include anything like that in the episodes, which makes me think that they didn't.
Yeah.
Vo, one of the men who'd spent 29 years on the row, said his most significant moment was touching grass for the first time in almost 3 decades.
Yeah.
Over time, the 4 men in this story, they got very close. They formed their own small friend group. And Erlon and Nigel decided to bring them back to the East Block, where death row stood empty, to talk about memories of their former life there. The men sort of took the Ear Hustle crew on a guided tour of the East Block, showed the crew the Death Watch cell where people were held after they were given an execution date. You know, each of their cells were single cells, which is very different than the main line. So the men also showed them these cells that they had stayed in for decades. Like Shaka, for instance, had lived in the same small cell from 1991 until 2022. So we're going to start first with Shaka. According to an article in the San Quentin News, Shaka is a man called Marvin Walker. He shot 3 people and killed a 15-year-old boy in a liquor store robbery gone bad in 1979. He was also convicted for robbing and beating a woman before shooting her twice in the head. Now, she survived and was able to identify him.
Yeah. That was all one incident?
2 incidences in the same year, like a couple months apart. At the time of this episode, Shaka had spent 42 years on death row. And right now, the 64-year-old is living in one of San Quentin's earned living units. It's housing for inmates with exceptional behavior. And recently, a court ruled Shaka's murder conviction was unconstitutional. So back in the 70s or 80s during his trial, 3 black jurors were dismissed unlawfully. They were dismissed because they were black.
Yeah.
And Shaka is also black.
Yeah.
He was retried and he took a plea deal for life with the possibility of parole. So he'll actually be eligible for parole in about 6 months.
How old was he in 79?
19, I think.
Oh, wow.
Or 20, something like that. Very young.
Yeah, just horrible, stupid, young decisions.
Yeah. Shaka said he's still coming to terms, still trying to adjust to the possibility of going home. You know, he says he doesn't want to be too high on the possibility because he's been down that road before and he's learned that planning is wishful thinking. But all he wants to do is go home to his family. His sister has a garden he wants to work in and he wants to go fishing. Shaka's plan is to catch 9 fish and release them back into the water, a fish for every family member who died while he was in prison. Now, the guy we'll call Steve, he was the most nervous to be back on the row. He almost looked as if he was going to turn around and just run out of there, right? So Steve, who was a kid on a college football scholarship when he committed his crime, had been on the row since he was 19. The first day he was on the yard in San Quentin, he was sitting next to this really prominent gang member on a bench when another inmate came over and just stabbed the man in the head. And Steve said after that, he just went back to his cell and cried. He had just he had no criminal history, had no idea what he was getting into.
Yeah.
So Steve Crittenden is one of the more famous inmates on death row. He was a freshman at Chico State University when he murdered an elderly couple during a botched burglary in 1987. Steve had responded to an ad in the school paper for a yard work gig, making $10 a week, mowing the lawn of the Chiapella family's house, right? Dr. William Chiapella was a wartime doctor. He treated soldiers in World War II. He did humanitarian work internationally. He was the recipient of the General Douglas MacArthur Scholarship Committee's most world-minded citizen award. And his wife, Catherine, she was a full-time mother, grandmother, and community booster. The Chiapellas were in their late 60s when Steve robbed their house, and it was just kind of a crime of opportunity. He mowed their lawn once. He thought they had money. He was really, really broke at Chico State. He didn't have, it was not like drugs or anything like that. It's just like literally he just didn't have any money.
Yeah.
So he thought he could burglarize their house, but the couple came home early, and Steve forced them to write a check to him for $3,000 and then stabbed them to death in an attempt to avoid getting caught.
Jesus Christ.
He used the money for rent and bills before his arrest a short time later. Now, Steve said he didn't even register the gravity of what he'd done to his victims until like 2005. You know, it was just a very much like focused on his own problems or whatever.
Huh.
He'd met his victim's family in 2021 for the first time. And more than anyone in either episode, he just still seems totally crippled with guilt. When Nigel interviewed Steve, he was grinding and clicking his teeth the whole time out of stress and the stress of talking about the murders and also the stress of like, for him, he said he doesn't want to say anything that would upset the family if the family were to listen.
Yeah.
So he was really careful with choosing his words. His parents just recently died, both of them. And part of his interview, he wanted to show Nigel a book that his mother had given him like decades before called The Way to Happiness, Common Sense Guide to Better Living. And, you know, it's all marked up and dog-eared. And, you know, in his interview, he said the only thing that he wanted more than anything was to be a person worthy of trust again. And Nigel said, "Are you?" And he just took this really long pause and he said, "Yeah, well, I'm working on it."
Yeah.
Which is really interesting to me.
Yeah.
So Steve made a few splashes in prison. He was married 6 times behind bars. He says he uses the same ad, like Lonely Hearts ad, every single time in the paper. For every time he's gotten a wife, he's just used the same ad word for word.
Damn. If it ain't broke, don't fix it.
And also he made headlines once when a young woman was caught smuggling him some heroin.
Well, that'll happen. You know, you got to slack on that.
Yeah, nothing about no heroin. All right. So Steve had a best friend for a number of years on the row, his most significant best friend and one of his earliest best friends. It was a man named Robert Alton Harris. Now, Robert had killed 2 16-year-old boys during a carjacking back in 1978.
So these are all robberies where they're like, oh, I'm going to rob someone. Oops, now they're also dead. Jesus.
After the moratorium on executions in California was lifted in the 90s, Robert was the first to be put to death. So he was super popular in the media, right? Everybody wanted to talk to him. So he ended up he used all of the money that he earned doing media interviews to just buy stuff for other guys on death row, folks with no money or no family, putting money on their books or whatever. Robert was executed in the gas chamber in San Quentin in 1992. And the guards led him by Steve's cell to say goodbye before his death, even though they weren't supposed to. Afterwards, every man on death row got a pint of Robert's favorite ice cream, black walnut. Robert Harris had paid and arranged for the ice cream prior to his death. So after he was put to death, everyone got a pint of ice cream. And that was the first time that had ever happened. Boredom was a huge factor on the row. They didn't have access to the programming that other inmates had, like the college classes, 12-step meetings, or activities. So they just invented stuff. Cujo, who was on the row for 25 or 26 years, said his favorite thing was watching the animals who snuck into the prison. So I couldn't figure out exactly who Cujo is. I used a lot of these to help identify these guys. I used the time that they spent on the row, right? Because these are some of the people who spent the longest time on the row. So based on that, he could either be a man who was a serial killer. He raped and murdered several women in California. Or I think he was one of two guys who partnered up and committed a string of robberies between 1995 and 1996, resulting in 8 murders.
Oh my God.
So either way, he's a serial killer. But you know. Anyway, Cujo liked watching the animals. East Block backed into some wilderness and had gaps under the doors, and they had a rat problem. And for some reason, they couldn't spray for pests or something like that. So he said that they actually let these cats into the building. So there were cats on death row killing the rats, and also birds that got in through the gaps in the door. So there were birds up in the rafters and rats hunting, cats hunting rats and families of cats. He was like,
that'd be my favorite thing too.
Yeah, he's like, it was like watching National Geographic or something like that. So Vo, who spent 29 years on death row, said he staved off boredom by learning how to crochet. He crocheted for years, and he spent a lot of time crocheting stuff for his family, mostly characters from the Minions movies for his niece and nephew. Vo and Steve Crittenden were actually particularly close on the row. They were very close. Now, Vo, I believe, is a man called Loy Tan Vo. He was convicted of the 1991 murder of a 73-year-old grandmother from Taiwan who was visiting her family in California. So back then, Vo was in his early 20s, living in San Jose. He had a good friend who was, by all accounts, pretty unhinged. He'd been arrested for indecent exposure and some convoluted plot to get revenge on a neighbor that he didn't like. He was white, but his parents say he started becoming obsessed with Japanese and Vietnamese culture. So he started claiming he was Asian. He would walk around sometimes speaking a gibberish Asian-sounding fake language.
Just to prove his authenticity. Just to show that he's really down.
His name was Edward Hajek. Anyway, Hajek and Vo had a crush on the same 16-year-old girl, Lori Nguyen, who had a boyfriend and wasn't interested in either of these older boy weirdos. So Lori had a falling out with her friend, 16-year-old Ellen Wang, at high school. And one day, Lori was hanging out with Hajek at a Baskin Robbins when Ellen Wang walked by with some of her friends. They called Lori a bitch. The girls got into a fight, and Hajek picked Ellen up and threw her into some bushes. So later, Hajek was obsessed with getting even with 16-year-old Ellen Chang for talking shit. Throwing her in the bushes wasn't enough, and he started telling people he wanted to kill her entire family in front of her. Now, no one believed he was actually serious. They just thought he was talking. But Vo, maybe because he also had a crush on Lori Nguyen, agreed to go with Hajek to Ellen's house and force their way in to maybe scare her or something, at least according to Vo. Vo later said, okay, I just thought we were going in there to scare her. Hadjick and prosecutors say otherwise. Anyway, Vo and Hadjick get to Ellen's house and everything goes sideways. The only people at the house were Ellen's 10-year-old sister, Alice, and their 73-year-old grandmother, Sue Hung. Vo and Hadjick forced their way in, tied up Sue Hung, and put her in an upstairs bedroom. And what followed was a bunch of fairly terrifying, stupid shit. So Ellen's mom came home. They forced her at knife point to take them to Ellen's school so they could get her and bring her back to the house. But Ellen had skipped school that day and no one could find her. They bound and gagged Ellen's dad when he came home, but by then Ellen's mom had managed to contact police. When police arrived, they found 73-year-old Sue Hung upstairs, bound and strangled with her throat slashed.
Ugh.
No one knows exactly what happened. So Vo claims he participated in the home invasion and false imprisonment of the family, but never intended on killing anyone. And he maintains that Hadjick killed Ellen's grandma himself alone while in a manic state. They were both convicted of capital murder.
Damn. So many RIPs also, just by the way. We just flew through so many.
Yeah.
Just like a little drive-by shooting of RIPs. That was just a lot.
Yeah, well.
That's why they're on death row, I guess.
All in all, the men on death row painted a pretty dark picture of the experience, like isolation, suicides, intense violence in the exercise yard, and intense regret. The women's perspective was surprisingly way, way different. And that's where we'll pick up on the next episode.
All right. Muriel, this is old school, man. We're taking it back to the roots. You listen to a podcast, and I'm like, well, if you're going to tell me about it, we're going to try to monetize it.
Save it for the pod.
Save it for the pod. Okay, our beautiful listeners, thank you for subscribing. We love you. We hope that you're good. Shout out to everyone who's been hitting us up on TikTok and YouTube and that kind of fun stuff. We're trying to grow the show, baby.
Yeah, we appreciate you so much.
Yeah. Okay. Bye, guys.
Bye.